Part 3 of an episode of Fiddletown, in Selected Stories by Bret Harte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Jeff Cowgill. Selected Stories by Bret Harte. An episode of Fiddletown. Part 3. Heaven forfend that I should use a pen that should be ever dedicated to an exposition of unalterable moral principle to transcribe Mrs. Tretherick's own theory of this interval and episode, with its feeble palliations, its illogical deductions, its fond excuses, and weak apologies. It would seem, however, that her experience had been hard. Her slender stock of money was soon exhausted. At Sacramento she found that the composition of verse, although appealing to the highest emotions of the human heart, and compelling the editorial breast to the noblest commendation in the editorial pages, was singularly inadequate to defray the expenses of herself and Carrie. Then she tried the stage, but failed signally. Possibly her conception of the passions was different from that which obtained with the Sacramento audience, but it was certain that her charming presence, so effective at short range, was not sufficiently pronounced for the footlights. She had admirers enough in the green room, but awakened no abiding affection among the audience. In this strait it occurred to her that she had a voice, a contralto of no very great compass or cultivation, but singularly sweet and touching, and she finally obtained position in a church choir. She held it for 3 months, greatly to her pecuniary advantage, and, it is said, much to the satisfaction of the gentlemen in the back pews who faced toward her during the singing of the last hymn. I remember her quite distinctly at this time. The light that slanted through the oriel of St. Dives's choir was wont to fall very tenderly on her beautiful head, with its stacked masses of deerskin-colored hair, on the low black arches of her brows, and to deepen the pretty fringes that shaded her eyes of Genoa velvet. Very pleasant it was to watch the opening and shutting of that small, straight mouth, with its quick revelation of little white teeth, and to see the foolish blood faintly deepen her satin cheek as you watched. For Mrs. Tretherick was very sweetly conscious of admiration, and, like most pretty women, gathered herself under your eye like a racer under the spur. And then, of course, there came trouble. I have it from the soprano, a little lady who possessed even more than the usual unprejudiced judgment of her sex, that Mrs. Tretherick's conduct was simply shameful, that her conceit was unbearable, and if she considered the rest of the choir as slaves, she, the soprano, would like to know it, that her conduct on Easter Sunday with the basso had attracted the attention of the whole congregation, and that she herself had noticed Dr. Cope twice look up during the service, that her, the soprano's friends, had objected to her singing in the choir with a person who had been on the stage, but she had waived this. Yet she had it from the best authority that Mrs. Tretherick had run away from her husband, and that this red-haired child who sometimes came in the choir was not her own. The tenor confided to me behind the organ that Mrs. Tretherick had a way of sustaining a note at the end of a line in order that her voice might linger longer with the congregation, an act that could be attributed only to a defective moral nature. That as a man, he was a very popular dry goods clerk on weekdays and sang a good deal from apparently behind his eyebrows on the Sabbath. That as a man, sir, he would put up with it no longer. The basso alone, a short German with a heavy voice for which he seemed reluctantly responsible and rather grieved at its possession, stood up for Mrs. Tretherick, and averred that they were jealous of her because she was pretty. The climax was at last reached in an open quarrel, wherein Mrs. Tretherick used her tongue with such precision of statement and epithet that the soprano burst into hysterical tears and had to be supported from the choir by her husband and the tenor. This act was marked intentionally to the congregation by the omission of the usual soprano solo. Mrs. Tretherick went home flushed with triumph, but on reaching her room frantically told Carrie that they were beggars henceforward, that she, her mother, had just taken the very bread out of her darling's mouth, and ended by bursting into a flood of penitent tears. They did not come so quickly as in her old poetical days, but when they came, they stung deeply. She was roused by a formal visit from a vestryman, one of the music committee. Mrs. Tretherick dried her long lashes, put on a new neck ribbon, and went down to the parlor. She stayed there 2 hours, a fact that might have occasioned some remark, but that the vestryman was married and had a family of grown-up daughters. When Mrs. Tretherick returned to her room, she sang to herself in the glass and scolded Carrie, but she retained her place in the choir. It was not long, however. In due course of time, her enemies received a powerful addition to their forces in the committeeman's wife. That lady called upon several of the church members and on Dr. Cope's family. The result was that, at a later meeting of the music committee, Mrs. Tretherick's voice was declared inadequate to the size of the building, and she was invited to resign. She did so. She had been out of a situation for 2 weeks, and her scant means were almost exhausted, when Ah Fe's unexpected treasure was tossed into her lap. The gray fog deepened into night, and the street lamps started into shivering life as, absorbed in these unprofitable memories, Mrs. Tretherick still sat drearily at her window. Even Carrie had slipped away unnoticed, and her abrupt entrance with the damp evening paper in her hand roused Mrs. Tretherick and brought her back to an active realization of the present. For Mrs. Tretherick was wont to scan the advertisements in the faint hope of finding some avenue of employment, she knew not what, open to her needs, and Carrie had noted the habit. Mrs. Tretherick mechanically closed the shutters, lit the lights, and opened the paper. Her eye fell instinctively on the following paragraph in the telegraphic column. Fiddletown, 7th. Mr. James Tretherick, an old resident of this place, died last night of delirium tremens. Mr. Tretherick was addicted to intemperate habits, said to have been induced by domestic trouble. Mrs. Tretherick did not start. She quietly turned over another page of the paper and glanced at Carrie. The child was absorbed in a book. Mrs. Tretherick uttered no word, but during the remainder of the evening was unusually silent and cold. When Carrie was undressed and in bed, Mrs. Tretherick suddenly dropped on her knees behind the bed and, taking Carrie's flaming head between her hands, said, "Should you like to have another papa, Carrie, darling?" "No," said Carrie after a moment's thought. "But a papa to help Mama take care of you, to love you, to give you nice clothes, to make a lady of you when you grow up." Carrie turned her sleepy eyes toward the questioner. "Should you, Mama?" Mrs. Tretherick suddenly flashed to the roots of her hair. "Go to sleep," she said sharply, and turned away. But at midnight the child felt 2 white arms close tightly around her and was drawn down into a bosom that heaved, fluttered, and at last was broken up by sobs. "Don't cry, Mama," whispered Carrie with a vague retrospect of their recent conversation. "Don't cry. I think I should like a new papa, if he loved you very much. Very, very much." A month afterward, to everybody's astonishment, Mrs. Tretherick was married. The happy bridegroom was one Colonel Starbottle, recently elected to represent Calaveras County in the legislative councils of the state. As I cannot record the event in finer language than that used by the correspondent of the Sacramento Globe, I venture to quote some of his graceful periods. "The relentless shafts of the sly god have been lately busy among our gallant salons. We quote one more unfortunate. The latest victim is the Honorable C. Starbottle of Calaveras. The fair enchantress in the case is a beautiful widow, a former votary of Thespis, and lately a fascinating Saint Cecilia of one of the most fashionable churches of San Francisco, where she commanded a high salary." The Dutch Flat Intelligencer saw fit, however, to comment upon the fact with that humorous freedom characteristic of an unfettered press. "The new Democratic warhorse from Calaveras has lately adventured in the legislature with a little bill to change the name of Tretherick to Starbottle. They call it a marriage certificate down there. Mr. Tretherick has been dead just 1 month, but we presume the gallant colonel is not afraid of ghosts." It is but just to Mrs. Tretherick to state that the colonel's victory was by no means an easy one. To a natural degree,